Hope you all enjoyed your luncheon.
Yes.
Courtesy of the Hilton, we want to thank them. And today we want to thank our two co-authors. We have Brody Mullins on my immediate left, Luke Mullins, his brother, two of three guys that grew up in our neighborhood, Irish family, and we're really proud of them. And today we're grateful to interview them. They were 7 and 9 years old when we met them. We're not going to give ages today, but I hear that one of them is going to be turning a significant birthday this August. Well, I've never done a live interview.
I think 40 is the...
40?
21.
Oh, 21. All right. Anyway, so I had to prepare for this interview over the last month. Charlie, probably my husband, I didn't introduce him, who's been in government a few times, didn't need to do as much preparing, but I had to read this fabulous book. And I say had to because those of you ladies out there in book clubs, what do we read? We read fiction. And this book is true to life, and you'll be amazed at the stories that you read about lobbying over the last 50 years. And that's the frightening part of the past. So book club ladies, I hope you'll all consider delving into this book. And for those of you that may not, it's Father's Day coming up on Sunday. And I'm sure you all know some man in your life that would enjoy reading this as well. So with that, I'd like to start off by asking them here, Brody and Luke, what the book is about and why it's so important to our audience today.
So first of all, thank you for having us. Luke's going to give an overview of the book. I just first wanted to thank the Kuppermans, who we have grown up with forever. The Kuppermans are responsible for all three of my first jobs in Washington. Of course, the first two were babysitting and mowing their lawn, so that may not count. When I graduated college, the Kuppermans are so close with us that when I graduated college and was getting my first job, Charlie gave me 3 of his finest Brooks Brothers suits to wear so I could look like a professional. Luckily, when Luke graduated college, Judie did not give her Luke suits. Luckily, they were Republicans and wouldn't do things like that. So, Luke, you want to give an overview?
So the book is about 3 lobbying dynasties, or sort of, groups of lobbyists, and we follow them over about a 40-year period from the late 1970s until today. And basically the book shows, one, how corporations came to power in Washington, and then 2, the ways that the evolution of tactics in the ways that lobbyists try to get what they want out of Washington. The first sort of lobbying dynasty is a Democratic dynasty centered around a guy named Tommy Boggs, who was the sort of quintessential fat cat lobbyist, cigar smoking, backroom operator. His father was an influential member of Congress, and he had a lot of sort of access to people in Washington, powerful people, based on his family connections. And he sort of exemplifies the sort of old-fashioned way of lobbying, which was, for campaign donations, meeting directly with members of Congress, and getting favors on behalf of your corporate clients. And he starts in the 70s when corporations are really out of power in Washington. It's really unions, consumer groups, public interest groups that were running Washington at the time. The corporate lobbying community was very disjointed. And Tommy Boggs was one of the first guys to help unify the corporate lobbying community and get them to fight back against a lot of the laws and regulations that they felt encumbered by. The second dynasty is Black, Manafort, and Stone, and you may know some of the members: Charlie Black, Paul Manafort, and Roger Stone. And they really exemplify sort of 80s and early 90s Washington. They drew their power from the sort of Reagan Revolution at a time when the sort of Washington was changing, and the Republican lobbyists who did exist prior to Reagan were out of favor. So corporations during that time, they needed people that could get access to Reagan. And these guys had worked on his campaign. That sort of is what started them. But one of the things that they do is sort of evolve lobbying from this sort of direct one-on-one talking to members of Congress to sort of a campaign model. These guys had a lot of their experience was in political campaigns. So they took a lot of those tactics, like, media strategy, paid advertisements, and sort of brought that to lobbying, where they would sort of turn a lobbying campaign into a sort of almost an election campaign, where you're partnering with other, other professions like polling and things like that. The third group is, again, another Democratic lobbyist by the name of Tony Podesta. And you may know him. He's interesting because he starts off as this sort of liberal activist. He was a guy who, for example, the Robert Bork fight in 1987, he was very instrumental in getting Bork's nomination tanked. And what he does is he discovers that a great way to get members of Congress to do what you want is to whip up support for or against something among the voters that are going to vote for that member of Congress. Because lawmakers are going to do whatever it is their voters want them to do. So he learned how to, instead of dealing directly with lawmakers, to use the media in order to whip up support for or against something among their voters. And he starts doing that as a liberal activist, but then goes into corporate lobbying and starts using those same tactics on behalf of Wall Street, big pharma, and these sort of large multinational firms. But those are and we follow these lobbyists over about the 45-year period, and they all sort of have tragic and sort of dramatic collapses over that period. So, I mean, the book was written. Some people that have read it have said, "Oh gosh, this reads like a novel. This reads like," some people say, "Is this fiction or not?" And that's really the goal, right? That you're going to read about these guys and the sort of arc of their lives, and through that you'll learn about lobbying and how it works and how it's evolved over time.
So I think that the second part of the question is, how do we get started on this? I've been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for about 20 years. Luke was at Washingtonian. He's now at Politico. In 2015, I heard that there was a very prominent young up-and-coming lobbyist for a drug company named Evan Morris, who was found dead on a golf course. And it was a very tragic situation. And a bunch of reporters, colleagues of mine, were trying to figure out what happened to this guy. And I sort of backed off. The Journal's a very slow-moving publication, so I sort of thought other of my colleagues are going to write about what happened with this guy. And about a year later, I realized that no one had written about him. No one had figured out what happened to this guy, so I decided to start looking into it. I spoke with my editors of the Journal, and they said, "Hey, we're a big national newspaper. No matter how tragic or sad a death of anyone is, we're not going to write about it unless there's a broader importance or something bigger going on." So I started researching this guy, and I found out that he owned a $300,000 mahogany wood boat among many expensive toys he owned. And I found there's only one company in the country that makes mahogany wood boats, a company called Hackercraft. They're based in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I called up the company. It's a very small company. The president of the company answered the phone, and I started asking about, did he know this lobbyist, and did he know this guy Evan Morris? And he very quickly sort of caught on to me and said, I'm not going to talk to you. The FBI called me, and I told them everything I know, and I'm not talking to you. And I thought, you told me enough. And so I sort of knew there was a story. And I spent the next 2 or 3 years investigating this guy, Evan Morris, his rise and his fall, and realized by partnering with Luke that the rise and fall of this lobbyist tells us a lot about how Washington has changed. So he's sort of one of our main characters to sort of tell this story. Another lobbyist we write about is Tony Podesta. It sounds like lots of people know Tony Podesta. He is the one of the most influential non-elected Democrats of maybe the last 20 years in Washington. And I sort of knew that he was going to be a great character for us when I was putting one of my daughters to bed one night, and she said, "Dad, are you working on a story?" And I said, "I am working on a story." And she said, "What is it about?" And I said, it's about a bad man." And she said, "Oh, does he steal money from people?" And I said, "Yes, he does." And she said, "Is he big and fat?" And I said, "He is big and fat." And she said, "Does he live in a mansion? Or does he live in a castle?" And he lives in a $10 million mansion. I said, "Yes, he does live in a castle." And she said, "Is he married to a witch?" And I said, "He is married to a witch." So I knew, if my daughter could tell this was going to be a good story, then it was going to be a good one. So those are two of our main characters.
Brody, Luke, did any of the lobbyists actually speak with you in doing your research? And could you comment on how you did some of the basic research to get the
Yeah.
We'll try this one.
Hello? Now? How's this? Okay. Could you say a few things about how you got the research to pull this book together, and who you were able to interview, who would you have liked to have interviewed, who says, "I've told the FBI everything I want to do"?
So the question was about how we did our research, who we were able to talk to, and who didn't. We talked to a great many people, the vast majority of whom are not named in the book. Of the sort of main figures, 3 of them are dead. A good portion of them are dead. A couple other ones, were not going to talk to us. But the one person we did talk to, was one of our main guys, was Tony Podesta. And that was fascinating. We sort of had gotten to him late in the process. So we had been working at the book for 5 years before we talked to him. And, as a reporter, it's always a bummer when someone doesn't want to talk to you. But when they don't, it just forces you to work much harder. And the story always benefits from that. So by the time we actually talked to Tony Podesta, we knew a ton about him. And that makes those interviews a lot better. But still, talking to him was fascinating for a number of
Can I tell the story about how we got him on the phone? So we'd done all this. He wasn't going to talk to us. So we did all this research, and we talked to his neighbors and his former clients, and he worked for a lobbying firm that had 170 employees. The firm collapsed. He took all the money out of it and basically fired everyone. And so all 70 of those people, were dying to talk to us, and he had lots of other enemies in Washington we spoke to. So we had all our research done, and then everyone in DC has an ego. Tony Podesta is not married. He doesn't have kids. He doesn't have a firm. He's been thrown out of the Democratic Party. He's literally sitting alone in his $10 million mansion, or castle, as my daughter calls it. And so I sent him an email, and I said, "Hey, I'm Brody Mullins. I'm working with my brother Luke. We're writing a book about you. No one's ever going to write a book about you again. If you want to talk, let's talk." And 5 minutes later, he called and said, "Come on down."
And it was fascinating talking to him, one, learning all these things about his own life, but also sort of his state at that time, where he had been sort of the top of, been the peak of Washington, and was sort of, his life had kind of collapsed, and he was very angry with a lot of people, but he was just so sort of sad and broken. And he was complaining about people not returning his phone calls, and that part, it just really struck me. Yeah, he was complaining about how Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, whom he had, Nancy Pelosi had gone to his mother's funeral. They were very close. After Podesta's firm collapses, Democrats are running as far away from them. And he was saying, it was either Pelosi or Schumer said Podesta wanted to start donating money to them again. And they were basically saying, it's probably best if you don't. And that was something that was just gutting to him. And
he's become a very sad figure.
He was saying that a woman who he is now married to, he had met her at a wedding, and people at that wedding had told her, "Hey, you do not want to be very careful of this guy. You should not spend time with him." Well, yes, exactly, because of all the things he was wrapped up in. And I don't know, to see a guy like that so gutted
What was really interesting about talking to Tony Podesta is, one, what Luke said, but also, even though we had our whole story written and we knew everything about, or thought we knew everything about him, he told some great stories about his life that we knew nothing about. And I've since realized that he's sort of like the Forrest Gump of the Democratic Party. He's always in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time. We all remember the day, or someone remember the day when Ed Muskie cried or didn't cry on the steps of the Manchester Union leader, which ended his presidential ambitions in 1972, I believe. Tony Podesta was his driver that day. And he said that Muskie got back in the car and Podesta's sitting in the back seat, like seconds after this happens. And Muskie sits down and says, "I probably should have done that." And Podesta says, "Nope, shouldn't have done that." And that was the end of Ed Muskie. He was also at the Democratic convention in 1968 with the riots, and said that he was walking down the street or in his office when the police broke in and clubbed the guy sitting next to him. So he's been in all these amazing events through his life, and we're luckily able to capture a lot of those fun stories by talking to him.
Okay, we're talking about the 1980s just now. There was a backlash by big business that began to take place. And you talk about the 70s with advocacy groups. Why was it that big business really spun up their lobbying efforts during the 80s?
I think just,
This is not, there it is.
Yeah.
All right, you can't talk from the side, you have to talk from the top. Okay, I was talking about the 80s because in the 70s you had advocacy groups that were really working to make changes. That was Jimmy Carter, right? Reagan comes along and big business starts to realize that they really need to spin things up. So what was it about the 80s that caused these changes?
Well, it really starts a little bit earlier in the 70s, kind of comes to fruition in the 80s. But basically, as we talked about a little bit before, in the late 60s and early 70s, corporations were really out of power in Washington. And it was unions were very strong at the time, consumer groups, public interest groups were really powerful.
Ralph Nader.
And they basically built out this whole kind of regulatory apparatus, really increased regulations on businesses that were very unpopular with businesses, but businesses really didn't have the muscle to stop any of that. And in fact, through really since from the New Deal up to the sort of mid 60s, business was supportive of a lot of the expansion of government that was taking place during that period. What happens is that in the mid 1970s, we have this economic calamity with high unemployment and high inflation, and that really discredits. It discredits the sort of economic, regime that sort of had been in this sort of liberal economics, and at the same time, businesses really see staring down what they believe is the collapse of the capitalist system. And they start to say, hey, we need to invest in Washington. So for example, the National Association of Manufacturers, which had been based in New York, they moved to DC because they say, hey, what's actually most important to commerce right now is politics. So a lot of money gets poured into Washington. It was really businesses really thought that capitalism was on the verge of collapse. So there's a real urgency. And that begins in the 70s. Yes, it begins in the 70s, but kind of comes to fruition, with Reagan. And, we start to sort of dismantle a lot of the sort of, liberal.
Where Reagan famously said, the government isn't the solution to your problems, it is the problem.
So throughout the periods of time that we've watched Washington, D.C., there have been some efforts to reform lobbying practices, political contributions. What's your take on whether or not it's a doable do?
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things we found in writing about the rise of corporate lobbying in Washington and attempts to rein in corporations and lobbying is that every time there's a well-intentioned reform, we have the opposite effect. And we give you 10 different examples. A good one might be the 2002 John McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform. Before 2002, companies, labor unions, individuals were allowed to give unlimited money to the political parties. America and the media said, that's bad, let's stop that from happening. What that meant was that political parties were getting less money from corporations and individuals, and these sort of super PACs and outside groups have started. So now, as everyone knows now in politics, the strongest voices, the most powerful voices in campaigns are these super PACs and outside groups, not the political candidates and not the political parties. So we live in a system that, because of this reform, has made outside unaccountable people the biggest voices in campaigns rather than the candidates, which is a crazy system to have. That's one example. Do you want to talk about?
I'll hit another example. And basically what we see is that basically every time that there is some well-intentioned ethics reform on K Street, in a sense, it basically forces the lobbying community to innovate and sort of create new and more effective strategies. So a great example of this was in 2007, following the scandal of a lobbyist named Jack Abramoff. There was a lot of sort of bipartisan outrage about what had happened. And Congress responds by banning the practice of gift giving between a lobbyist and a member of Congress, right? So, and it also kind of creates this additional stigma on lobbyists, right? They become even more unpopular. So what happens is that the next couple of years, we actually see fewer lobbyists registering, right? So on the surface, it seems like, wow, there's fewer lobbyists in Washington. But what's really happening is that a lot of those lobbyists sort of said, oh, I'm not a lobbyist anymore, I'm a strategist, right? So they're still kind of doing the same thing, but they're not doing this sort of, lobbying has a very technical definition, right? You're spending, 20% of your time talking directly to a member of Congress, and there's plenty of ways to influence that member of Congress without talking directly with them. So what that basically does is pull the lobbying industry from this sort of regulated, above board industry, albeit viewed as unsavory, to this into the shadows, right? So there's this sort of acceleration of this world that we call shadow lobbying, which are people that aren't registered and they're not technically lobbying, but they're working, media strategies, digital strategies, grassroots strategies, all designed to influence members of Congress, but doing so in a way that is completely unregulated. And we have no idea how many people are doing this or exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, and the lobbyists know this. We have a great quote in our book from Tony Podesta. When Barack Obama was elected and he was going to drain the swamp, Obama's from Chicago, Tony Podesta's from Chicago, and Tony Podesta's trying to make it seem like he's really close to Obama, and Obama's trying to drain the swamp and get rid of lobbying. And Tony Podesta's quote is, if Obama banned lobbyists from driving, we'd all get cars and drivers, and that's true.
Let's talk a little bit about each of you, what the wildest lobbying effort was that shocked you in doing your research on the part of corporations.
So the one that I heard, this is actually not in the book, but one that Brody and I talk about and think about a lot. There's a tactic that's one of the more advanced tactics known as, it's called intercepts. And basically what you do there is a lobbyist would engage a person who is from the home state of a particular member of Congress. And you basically get that person to sort of bump into the member of Congress as if it's sort of an organic, hey, at the supermarket or something. And you want that person to say, hey, have you heard about this new, this new tech bill? That's really interesting. But we had heard about someone using that practice that had actually gotten to somehow been able to infiltrate the bridge game of a wife of the sort of target lawmaker, that they had gotten somebody sort of that deep in there. And again, this is these intercepts are pretty advanced tactics, but again, totally unregulated, right? There's no paper around that. So that was pretty wild for me.
So there's a whole bunch of really good examples of lobbying campaigns in our book where it shows that companies and industries and lobbyists can have more power over public policy than the government itself. And a good example we use, an early sort of pivot point of this, is the Clinton healthcare bill in 1993. Bill Clinton had just become president. He's in the honeymoon period. The Democrats have the House, they have the Senate. 70% of Americans said that they were unhappy with their healthcare system. Clinton wasn't the most popular president. Remember, he won with 43% because of Ross Perot. But either way, he was in his honeymoon period. Their number one goal is to be liberal Democrats and come out with this national healthcare plan. And the year before, 17 Senate Republicans had also had their own national healthcare plan. So this is something that really could have gotten done. And then the healthcare lobby got involved. Mainly the health insurance companies were against health insurance reform because they would lose the business. They would lose their industry. Bill Clinton was elected with, when Bill Clinton ran for election in 1992, he spent around $100 million getting elected. The health insurance industry spent around $100 million defeating his healthcare plan. And that was an example for us that shows us that the lobby industry can be more powerful than the President of the United States at times. And that lobbying fight also changed the course of history. Bill Clinton came in trying to be a liberal Democrat, fulfilling the Democratic legacy of creating national health care reform, something that Democrats had wanted since FDR. Afterwards, remember, he switched and became a moderate centrist. He started this triangulation thing. He became much more of the sort of modern pro-business Democrat. He was his presidency was known for NAFTA, welfare reform, and balancing the budget. So he really sort of moved to the middle because he basically got his butt kicked by the corporate lobby.
Well, in terms of what gets lobbyists in trouble, one of those recent phenomenon occur when you represent a foreign entity and you do not register as a lobbyist. And your book brings out a couple of interesting stories about people getting caught lobbying and not being registered. Can you say a few words about the one most in the news recently was Manafort in Ukraine?
Right. So, I mean, generally, the foreign lobbying market is sort of, that's the kind of Wild West of the lobbying industry. It's more, dubious and sort of disreputable. So, a lot of lobbyists that care a lot about their reputations won't do that. And because of that, foreign governments tend to pay more money, right? So that business tends to attract the kind of rogues of the lobbying industry. So recently, we wrote about Paul Manafort and his collapse and Tony Podesta's collapse was sort of tied to the same campaign where they were working on behalf of these pro-Russian interests in Ukraine. And they ran this lobbying campaign for several years and just never registered as, which you have to do, right? If you're representing a foreign government before the U.S., you have to register. For many years, that there was just no enforcement of that law. So both Tony Podesta and Paul Manafort just assumed that they could get away with it. And because of all the heat that Paul Manafort was under, the Department of Justice started to look at these foreign lobbying, his activities, and that's what they ultimately got him for.
Yeah, one of the amazing things about all the characters in our book is that if they're all happy making $1 million, they'd all still be in business and doing fine. But once they make $1 million, they want $2 million. Once you make $2 million, you want $20 million. That's what happened to Paul Manafort. That he made $60 million lobbying for the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, or working for the pro-Russian president of Ukraine for 10 years or so. Had he simply paid his taxes,
Right.
he'd be fine.
Yeah.
So it was not that hard for him to be, back in business.
But I mean, Manafort, for example, you start making $1 million, and your balance sheet starts to expand. So now you got a bunch of different houses, you got a bunch of different mortgages, your kids have different mortgages, and that's where they get into trouble.
What was his gardening bill at his?
I gotta say, I forget, $60,000 a month.
A
or
month.
something?
A month.
Yeah.
It's a lot of flowers.
So you've got to, you got to bring in the money to sustain that. If that is important.
So a secret we probably shouldn't talk about. Luke and I are working on an op-ed for the New York Times that basically says that if Donald Trump wins, Paul Manafort is going to come back and become a lobbyist, and he's probably going to be the most successful or at least wealthiest lobbyist of all time. Donald Trump, as we all know, really respects loyalty, and no one has been more loyal to Donald Trump than Paul Manafort. He's the only person who went to jail for him. So we also look at Paul Manafort now as this loser and convicted felon, but he could be the the most important person in Washington in a couple months.
Most more unelected, certainly. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what efforts to reform lobbyists have been done in the past?
So I do think the most recent ethics reform was the 2007 gift ban. What are some other recent ones, bro? Well, you mentioned
I think that was the
Feingold. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been I think the 2007 one is the most interesting or most recent one, and the whole idea there was to separate the cozy relationships between lobbyists and members of Congress. And as Luke mentioned, that sort of just led to people. Those rules only applied to registered lobbyists, so people just simply stopped registering as lobbyists. I mean, as Luke said, the height. If you look at the federal lobbying database, the most lobbyists who've ever had registered was 2007, and that law takes effect, and the number of lobbyists goes down. And if you think the number of lobbyists going down in Washington is true, that's crazy.
What about Google? Talk about Google and the antitrust laws.
Yeah. So there is currently, Google's in an antitrust fight at the moment, but Google is sort of one of the companies that we focus on in our book, and we focus on them because Tony Podesta was sort of the kind of big tech's man in Washington. He was sort of the most influential early big tech lobbyist, and one of the things that he does was he sort of helps Google kind of get off the ground. In 2005, Google's lobbying office was, it was sort of a bunch of academics. It was almost like a university campus where they would have people that were very well schooled in policy, and what they would do is go out and talk to members of Congress. And
Can I just jump in for a second?
Go ahead.
So Google thought that the way to win a lobbying fight and Washington policy fight was to have the best argument. And Tony Podesta said, no, that's not how it works. It's campaign donations, it's relationships, it's getting in there.
Yeah, exactly. So he kind of transitions the firm's lobbying shop away from this kind of high-minded sort of university approach to more of like let's just accumulate and apply power. And one of the great examples of that is in 2012, the FTC staff actually authorized or recommended that the FTC's leadership move forward with an antitrust case against Google. And this would have been a crisis for Google, which has always positioned itself as this, very sort of a company that was out to do the right thing, right? And there was a lot of evidence that, in fact, they were just using their power to kind of crush other competitors. And the FTC staff said, "Hey, we want to move forward with this," but the commissioners are the people that actually had to sign off on it. So Google sort of embarks on this lobbying effort that was focused on generating opposition to an antitrust case among the people that the FTC's commissioners would look to for support, right? So these were, academics, think tank people, lawyers, people that Google wanted sort of research out there saying that, hey, if the FTC, if you guys move forward with this case, you're actually going to lose this case. So they started this campaign, which they called Project Eagle, which involved about 50 different academics and sort of coordinated them to write op-eds and talk publicly about how this antitrust case was bad. It was bad for consumers. Do you want to?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and then ultimately, in an extraordinarily rare move, the commissioners voted to not accept the recommendation of their staff and not move forward with an antitrust exemption, with an antitrust case. Now, the politics of all this have changed, and right now, Google is facing an antitrust case. But gosh, this was a decade ago, and through its own very sophisticated lobbying muscle, Google was able to get this case shelved. And it was just a huge victory for them.
There's another aspect of lobbying which has a bit of political incest to it, and that is former members, when they leave the Hill, tend to go find their golden parachute with a lot of lobbying firms. Would you comment on how much of that you came across?
It's actually a topic that we don't address that much in our book. I mean, it's certainly true that I think 25 or 50% of former members of Congress who leave become lobbyists because there's just so much money downtown. It's really a broader structural problem with Washington in that Washington, like here, is an expensive place to live. Staffers who come to Washington who want to change the world, whether Republicans or Democrats, go to Capitol Hill and they take jobs for $30,000 a month or $30,000 a year or $50,000 a year. I mean, they're not expensive, not high-paying jobs. As soon as you have get married or have kids, you can't afford that lifestyle. So it's really hard for people to, stay in Washington on the government side. So a lot of people go downtown, and I think members and staffers see the same thing. I remember talking to Jack Abramoff before his scandal when he was a lobbyist, and I covered the lobbying industry, and he would say, when I go in and talk to a staffer, I always say, hey, someday come work for me and triple your salary. So that staffer knows at any point I can jump downtown, triple my salary, and they know I probably shouldn't screw over Jack Abramoff's clients because he's the guy who's going to triple my salary. And
right. And just to build off that point, one of the proposals that ethics and watchdog groups have always said is a great way to reform all this is to sort of pay staffers more and to pay members of Congress more. And the idea is that by paying staffers so little, you're almost asking for corruption in the form of what Brody's just talking about. Now, as you might imagine, the idea of paying staffers or members of Congress more could not possibly be less popular. So it's one of those things that probably doesn't happen. But you can see, as you said, you can see the incentive structure there lending itself to the, or certainly reinforcing the problems that we see.
How are we doing on time? One more question. Is there anything like K Street elsewhere in the world?
Gosh, that's a really good question. Certainly at the time that K Street came into being, in the really 1980s, it was sort of the first kind of concentrated industry, right? In terms of today, I've got to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. That's
But it really seems like no. I mean, we have not been able to find another country that has a corporate lobbying apparatus that exists to influence laws and legislation, and that seems kind of crazy. You would think in the EU and the Brussels there'd be a big lobbying operation, and there isn't. And I don't know what it is about America that says that that has allowed for us to have a lobbying operation that other countries don't. I don't know.
Well, the period that he was referencing in 1980, lobbyists were known as Gucci golfers. And anybody that wore Gucci loafers with the Gucci buckle across the top of the shoe was seen as a lobbyist. And so,
and for many years in the legal community in Washington, lobbyists were really looked down upon as this sort of unsavory business that was to be avoided. But after the business starts to explode and it's generating so much money, all of those firms opened their own lobbying shops.
Would you like to open it up for questions?
Yes.
We'll open it up. Are there some interesting questions out there in the audience? There's Jeannie. Carol Carter.
You early on mentioned Charlie Black. I was acquainted with Charlie Black. And in Florida, several of us in the party here, when he was the manager of a campaign, we'd go like, that's a loser. I don't know how he ever got so successful because most of the campaigns that he managed didn't win.
Is that right? Yeah.
And wasn't Paul Manafort at one time his partner?
Yeah, exactly. They were partners. Yeah.
and Roger.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, there was another one.
Yeah. Lee Atwater as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I actually heard you guys, or one of you, on the Ruthless podcast. Love those guys so much. Oh my gosh. I have several questions and I don't want to take up too much time. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 30 years. I was publisher of Capitol File for a little while.
Oh yeah, of course.
And so one of the things that I'm looking back on now as you all are talking, during the time that the correspondence dinner was so big and everything was going on, I'm now thinking back going, was I doing something, were we doing something illegal? Because it was, we'd have a big group of the federal affairs companies come to us. We would have a big party, and then we'd have, Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so in the room, and there weren't the restrictions that you had to have. You didn't have to have
Right.
food on toothpicks and stuff like that. Looking back on that, was that kind of like an unsavory thing to do? I mean, everyone did it.
It may have been unsavory, but I don't think it was illegal. Isn't the widely attended events exemption?
Yeah, but also I think the point is that the media plays a role
Yes.
in the swamp, and
Yes.
the media doesn't report about that.
No.
And
Not at all.
in our book, we do report about that.
Yeah, I love
I think
it.
we're sort of the first time that people have held the media in some way accountable for that. I mean, one of the people who write about, who we haven't mentioned, is a guy named Jim Kordovich, who was basically a lobbyist who came to Washington, and his idea was to try to lobby the reporters to write stories that helped his clients. If you're a member of Congress, you get your information from several ways. You talk to your staffers, you talk to lobbyists, you talk to constituents, and you read the Capitol Hill newspapers. And so this lobbyist, Jim Kordovich, knew that if he could get reporters to write stories that were helpful to his clients, the member of Congress and staff would read those stories and would think that whatever is being written is true. The way he got his influence was by throwing these big parties for the media. He became a sponsor of the White House Correspondents' Dinner that you probably went to. Oh, the brunch, the Tammy Haddad
Right.
Post.
Yes.
At the big Washington Post mansion.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the idea was to make these reporters feel special and invite them to these parties with, fancy people from the Obama administration and House and Senate aides.
Right.
And therefore he created relationships with these people. And that when his client, whether it's Goldman Sachs or the government of Saudi Arabia, wanted some story out there saying this bill would be bad or this bill would, help Wall Street, he would go to lunch and try to get with reporters, try to get their stories out. So,
Yeah.
that's one way that the media plays a role. Another way is, I remember it wasn't that long ago, probably when you were there, when the Washington Post first suggested the idea of a salon dinner. This is when you had corporate lobbyists and executives would pay a fee to come to a Washington Post sponsored event where the Secretary of Commerce was there and you could ask him or her questions. And
Ariana
the Washington Post was
Huffington.
The Washington Post was laughed out of town like that. Like they couldn't. It seemed a pay-to-play event for lobbyists to get access to members of Congress. Now everyone does it, and it only took 10 years to go from saying that's no way we do that to now everyone does it.
Right, and it's just right there, all in your face. So, two other quick questions. I'm really curious now that you're talking about Tony Podesta. Did he have anything to say about his ex-wife Heather getting to be such a big player since they hate each other?
Oh, it's a good question. We didn't ask him about how he views on what he thinks of her current success.
Yes.
But my goodness, during their divorce, he was really vicious about her lobbying because she has her own lobbying firm, and he in his filings he was basically saying, you are only successful because of me, because of the things that I taught you, because of the Podesta name.
Right.
So that was really vicious. I got the sense,
Well, I was gonna say to go back a little bit. We traced the downfall of Tony Podesta to their divorce. So they're both successful lobbyists. They were making tons of money. He was addicted to art. He was spending millions and millions of dollars on art. She told him to stop spending money on art. He didn't. She found out. They get divorced. More importantly, because he was so addicted to his art, when they divorced and she got 50%, he wanted to keep the art. So he had to give her basically everything else. Once he gave her everything else, all he had was this art. He had no liquid assets. He then had to start doing foreign lobbying to get a lot more money. He bumps into Paul Manafort and they all go down with the ship.
Lastly, and I'll make this really quick.
I'm sorry. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert on that one.
It's interesting, and I know it's a little politically incorrect to ask what your affiliation is, your political affiliation, but I know one of you works for Politico, the other's with Washingtonian. I know Kathy, but Politico is very liberal. Do you, is it an issue being writers for these two publications that tend to bend a little liberal, especially Politico, if that's not your affiliation?
So
That's it. Now I'll stop
No,
with
that's
that.
okay. So I was with the Wall Street Journal. Luke was with Politico. I've actually,
But I worked for
Washingtonian,
Washingtonian
yeah.
for many years. Yeah.
So my personal strategy, I only know one other reporter who does this, but I don't register. I'm not a registered voter, and I don't vote. And I feel like that's because I don't want to feel like I'm favoring one side or the other. And people say that's a stupid thing to do, but like that's just the philosophy that I've used. I feel like if you're trying to cover politics impartially, but then you go vote for one side, I feel like that would mess me up. So I don't register. So therefore, I'm not registered.
I mean, I'm registered as an independent. I have not been at Politico that long, but I've certainly never gotten any ideological pressure in any direction. Yeah.
So I mean, if we're going on this topic, sorry to keep answering questions that aren't being asked, but I feel like I believe almost every reporter tries the best they can to be impartial and be down the middle. The issue is, thank you. I believe they try. So you got to hear the rest of my answer. So I believe they try. The problem is that most reporters are the same. We all went to four-year colleges. We all went to exclusive universities. We all grew up in the East Coast. We're all, have good backgrounds, and we all tend to grow up in Democratic areas. So for someone who grows up in Boston, their down the middle is a little to the right. If someone who grows up in, Kansas, their down the middle is to the left. But reporters tend to be on East Coast people who went to we were the demographic of the Democratic Party. For the most part. And I feel like even though people try to be down the middle, their down the middle is different. Reporters don't own guns. They don't go to church. They don't, we're.
What about reporters in Florida?
That's for reporters in Florida different. I guess I'm talking about the Washington, D.C. reporters.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, that's what I think.
I think we have a question in the back with Jeannie Rock.
I listened to Bill O'Reilly's broadcast, and he says that the corporate media rely heavily on what K Street tells them to say, to have their broadcaster say on the news. And I don't see quite the connection. I think you touched on it a little. But yeah, he says that, about 8 o'clock in the morning, they call K Street, and there's some kind of an agenda that's fed into their reportage. Sometimes the phraseology is the same between each network, So can you address that at all?
I've never been invited on that call. Maybe I should go. No, I think that there is. I think maybe what he's talking about is that there is an establishment in Washington that's Republicans and Democrats and lots of members of the elite media folks and members of Congress where there is
Group think.
Yeah, there's
is
definitely
absolutely the case. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's not like an explicit. I don't. I mean, there's no such like call like that, but there's definitely people in Washington, right? I think Lucas said it right. People in Washington tend to think the same things because they're all talking to each other. For example, before the 2016 election, no one in Washington thought that Donald Trump was going to win. Companies didn't think he could win. The media didn't think he'd win. Members of Congress didn't think he could win. And he won. It's because we're all just talking to each other, and that's that's a problem.
Just to give you an idea, I was in the news business as an anchor for over 15 years, and we used to have a news director who would come in the morning, and he would write on the board in our story meetings, "Who will we screw today?" So that shows you sometimes how slanted they can really be. It depends on who's running the ship sometimes, because you could come in with a story and write it up, and if they don't like the angle that story had, you had to go back and change it and find the sound bites that work with it. They definitely had an agenda at times that they wanted fulfilled, and it was your mission to get it done.
Okay, I think our time is about up. Right, Kathy?
Correct.
All right. We want to thank Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins very much for sharing the inside story on lobbying on K Street. They will be in the lobby here outside the doors with their book, and they will be happy to personalize it for any of you that would like to stop by.